evening, everyone. Thanks for coming out. I normally don't get dragged along to Jane's book talks very often. I have a lot of night commitments myself, but we live in Morristown. We're right here in town. We're members of the congregation. I had a free night, so she invited me to come along and introduce her and share some perspectives of my own about share perspectives of my own about this project that she's thrown herself into the last few years. How's that? Okay. Thank you. Sorry. So, Jane and I both turned 70 this year, and you get to a certain age. I think folks here in the audience, at least on this side, can relate to that. You get to a certain age, and you become a big believer in perspective, the kind of perspective that helps you make sense out of things that sometimes it took you years to realize and piece together. You know, when did a recession begin? When did I fall in love with somebody? And with the benefit of hindsight sometimes, you're able to make sense out of things that perhaps you might not have been able to realize were happening as they were happening. Jane retired a few years ago, threw herself into this project, and at the time there were papers all over the house, there were research books arriving every day, trips into New York to the New York Historical Society to bury herself in maps and books. But looking back on it now that she's finished this, at least the first stage of this, it's very apparent to me that there are several influences in my wife's life that this was the culmination of, that I can now see very, very clearly. One is her lifelong interest in writing. She was always interested in writing from the time she was your kid's age. First thing she did when she retired a few years ago was start a blog on being a retiree and what that's all about. So that's always been a source of creative outlet for her. Add to that her professional life, her professional career in healthcare, particularly her interest in women's healthcare. When I met Jane, she was at St. Clair's Hospital. She created the Women's Health Center there, if you drive by there and recognize it. Then she moved on to the Atlantic Health System, Morristown Hospital, Overlook, where she's been director of neuroscience there until she retired a few years ago. So a very deep commitment to healthcare, the availability of healthcare, and the role of medicine generally in society. Add to that her own personal medical crisis 22 years ago or so, diagnosed with breast cancer initially, prompted her to get the genetic screening that revealed a mutation that had been passed down through her family, that prompted her to research back through the generations, following that defect all the way back to a long-lost relative named Matilda, who became the inspiration for the books that she's put together. And then finally, her Jewish identity. Jane was the daughter of two kids from Brooklyn who got married, moved out to New Jersey, Whippany, which I guess was the country back then, raised Jane here, and although not religiously observant, very much Jewish identity, and as we all know, when our enemies come after us, they don't stop to ask how often you've been to shul lately. So with that, it's my pleasure to introduce my wife, Jane, who will share some ideas about what she's been doing the last few years.
Thank you, David. Can everybody hear me all right? Okay. So first, what I'd like to do is point out these two screens. They have a slide loop of about 150 black and white photographs of New York City between 1880 and 1910. So I want to take you on a time travel back to that period of time, and that's 123 years ago. So those are pictures of street life, the Blackwell prison, the immigration that went on, the largest immigration that most everybody here has some connection to, the hospitals, the operating rooms, and what people wore. So if you just look at the slides, I'm going to narrate a little bit about that time and the setting that my books took place in. And I thought the slides would help it feel more real. So 123 years ago, at the turn of the 20th century, McKinley was president of the United States. He was shot a year later and died from infection. And there was no penicillin around then. Penicillin didn't get discovered, antibiotics didn't get discovered till the 1920s. And as David mentioned, I'm very, very interested in the history of medicine. Having worked in the healthcare field for a long time, my 3 children are all in healthcare, It has been so much a part of my life. And having been ill also, and getting different treatments, many of those treatments were discovered during the period of my illness. I've had ovarian cancer now starting 15 years. I've always been on treatment, and it keeps changing, and things are getting discovered. And that's kind of a high speed, especially compared to this time, because during the 1900s, the average life expectancy for men was 48 years old, and for women it was 49. So imagine that. I mean, some of our kids just are moving out of the house at 40, for God's sakes. I mean, our people grew up really fast then. They got married younger, they tried to accomplish the things in their life during their younger years. And they did it with less technology and fewer tools. In 1900, there were only 500 cars in New York City. Imagine that. You'll see in some of the pictures, everyone either walked or they got in a cart or a carriage or a buggy, and there was horse manure everywhere. And it's really quite unbelievable because there were even outhouses in the Lower East Side. Do you guys over there know what outhouses are? Okay. There were not indoor toilets or indoor sinks and water. People had to go in the back of the apartment building to a faucet and fill up their pail with water and lug it up 3-5 flights of stairs. Elevators were just getting used in 1880. So buildings were lower. I mean, it was just so different. And so I just found this because this was one of the reasons there were so many diseases and infections, is sanitation was a huge problem in New York City. There were even people as a career, and they were called the night soil people. Did anybody ever hear of the night soil men? Oh my goodness. The night soil men went from outhouse to outhouse after midnight, shoveled everything that went through the pit, shoveled it into their wagons that were horse-drawn, went over to the East River that separates Manhattan and Brooklyn, and dumped it in the river. And for many, many years, the night soil men were Irish because the Irish came early to Manhattan. They came during the potato famine before the Civil War. They were poor. The Catholic Church, the Protestant Church, did not have the facilities to help these people. They settled into the Five Corners slum in New York. First, they went down to the tenements in the Lower East Side. They were there before the Jewish people. Then they moved to Five Corners, and many of them were uneducated, illiterate, they couldn't read, and they took these jobs. But after the Civil War, and the Southern African American free people began to migrate north, they came to New York too and they fought with the Irish constantly. And they fought over the night soil jobs. Can you believe it? That's how bad it was. So electricity had been installed on the streets of New York in some areas down Broadway, but only 3% of Americans, 3 out of every 100 homes had electricity. So if you look at any of the historical buildings from that time, and there's quite a number of them in Morristown that are preserved, they have huge fireplaces. And they have fireplaces in a lot of the bedrooms because that was still how they got their heat in the winter. Only 6% of Americans graduated from high school in 1900. It was in the public schools, you could leave after 4th grade. Fourth grade was a dividing line where the feeling was that you could write, you can read the newspaper, because most newspapers are on the 5th grade reading level, and you could do simple math. So that was the cutoff for the limited education. And then they went and they worked. And they worked to help bring money into their homes because the poverty was just unimaginable. My grandmother, my mother's mother, went to school till 8th grade. And my mother's generation was the first generation in my family that finished high school. And most of them went off to college afterwards. But it was a very, very different time that your ancestors lived in. And they were so brave because they came from places in Europe that were just like Gaza. I mean, it was terrible. They were tormented by living there. In many parts of Europe, Jews were not allowed to own property or to have stores and rent property. So they used push carts, and they put all their wares in the push carts. And you'll notice when you see some of the street scenes, you'll see that there's an abundance of push carts with pots and pans, with rags, with all kinds of things. And that was a vestige of their life in Europe. And so once they settled in and had enough money, they stopped selling out of their carts and started getting storefronts. But that was a transition that was taking place in the late 1800s and early 1900s. There were no refrigerators. Ice boxes hadn't been invented yet, and people had to buy the food almost every day and buy things that wouldn't spoil. And stomach bugs and stomach infections were the third largest cause of death at that time. So much bacteria was in the food, and if the individual didn't have a healthy body that could fend for themselves, they got infections, and then there were no antibiotics. So things like heart disease, cancer, diabetes they weren't even on the charts for major causes of death. Does anybody want to guess what the top cause of death was?
Alcohol?
No, but good try. No, that was the third. Tuberculosis was the second. And tuberculosis very much in my stories. The first cause of death was pneumonia. So people would get respiratory infections, and there was nothing they can do about it. They died really fast. And that was the only blessing about it, was that if you got pneumonia and you were elderly or you were an infant, it didn't take long for you to pass away. There was very little they could do. Infant mortality, every baby born had a 20% chance of dying before they were 1 year old. Unbelievable. And there were no vaccines. I mean, it was in some ways primitive, but it was also the beginning of the Industrial Revolution, and there were so many inventions. The sewing machine was invented, the automobile was invented, electricity was invented. There was a climate of very fast change that was going on, but medicine lagged behind. Almost every major discovery in medicine was occurring in England and France and Germany. They were so much more advanced, and the doctors at the turn of the century, the older ones, were a vestige of the Civil War, and there was very little quality control about who even got to be a doctor. Germ theory, the understanding that washing your hands could get rid of germs, that was not discovered until around the Civil War period. And so nobody used gloves in the operating room. I mean, they had bleachers with people sitting, taking notes, smoking, having their breakfast. And the prime, because the lighting was so limited, the prime time to do an operation was not 7:30 first operation out of the gate. It was noon, when the light, because they had glass ceilings in the ORs, and the light was overhead at noon. And so that would amplify what other synthetic light they could come up with in the operating room. And so it was just so different. Hospitals were really different. They didn't understand how easily diseases could transmit from one to another. And so that all plays into the setting of in the hands of women. Now, immigration, there are certain themes that I really got very involved in researching in my book. Kind of from the outside, sort of going into the funnel, was what was going on in the immediate world of New York City at that time. You had the very wealthy people uptown, all the robber barons and the Vanderbilts and the Carnegies and even the old guard people who had all the huge mansions, the Fricks and the Astors who guarded the social world of the wealthy. And they lived a very, very charmed life. And my father used to say, yeah, but they didn't have air conditioning. And they didn't. They lived within the elements of their society, but they lived at the top end. They were part of that 3% that installed electricity in their homes. And then you had, and you had wealthy Jewish people on the Upper East Side. But those people were German Jews. And the German Jews and the Eastern European Jews saw themselves as distinctly different. The Germans had come earlier in the 1800s. Some of the major financial houses like the Seligmans and so forth, they had been the peddlers before the Civil War and had generations of life in the United States to integrate into the culture, make money, learn the language, and they settled up near where Mount Sinai is. And as a matter of fact, has anybody read the book? A couple of people? All right, I'm gonna be real careful about spoilers, but let me just tell you, there was a real dichotomy between the Jews who lived uptown and the Jews who lived downtown. And the Jews who lived uptown really did very little to help the Jews who lived downtown. They didn't see the European Jews as being up to their level in society. They almost didn't really see them as being the same kind of Jewish. And as David alluded to before, it really in the end makes very little difference because Jewish is Jewish. But back then, there was almost like a caste system. And so there was a huge difference between the cultures uptown, downtown. Downtown, what happened, if you kind of took a walk straight across Lower Manhattan, you would go from one ethnic group to the next corridor of another ethnic group, and around Mulberry Street were the Italian immigrants, and you'd work your way east until you got to the Lower East Side, and that's where, by 1900, a lot of the Jewish immigrants lived. And so, if you didn't think about what was hung on the wall, whether it was a mezuzah or it was a crucifix, life was very similar across Manhattan. Same challenges, same kind of difficulties. And one of the big difficulties was there was no way to do any family planning. At that time, the Comstock laws, which some of you may have heard a little more about since Roe v. Wade was overturned, and Texas has tried to resurrect them from 1880. Comstock was a man who very successfully got the federal government to pass an act that made birth control illegal. You could not get birth control. It couldn't be manufactured here, it couldn't be mailed, it couldn't be talked about by your physicians, and it couldn't be purchased legally on the open market. Abortion was illegal. Abortion from the midwives or procedurally was outlawed. The scientists had not yet discovered ovulation, so they did not understand the rhythm method by counting days that a woman was fertile versus could not have her egg fertilized. So there was no rhythm method. And it was and courtships were much shorter, as you can imagine, because how long would a couple who wanted to get married wait to get intimate? And so it was really difficult. You had 1,000 people coming in from Europe every day, most of whom were people who were not well educated, poor as poor could be, and young. And you had this incredible proliferation in the population. And what women tried to do was to go to midwives and terminate pregnancies that they couldn't manage to have. Now, that's kind of interesting too, because our knowledge about what happens during the pregnancy is so different today. We know a lot more, trust me, than they knew back in 1900. And so the question of when does life begin was a really interesting question that everyone asked, because before Comstock, when abortions were legal, there was still some feeling that at some point you could not have an abortion anymore. There was a line, and the line was when the mother felt quickening. And quickening is when the baby starts moving inside the mother, and the baby is big enough that the mother can feel the feet pushing against her inside of her belly, and that was called quickening then. And when quickening occurred, there were no more abortions allowed. And because of this strain, social services like education in 5 corners, there were some classrooms with 80 children in a classroom. I mean, that's crazy. The state of New York couldn't take care of all these children. The parents couldn't afford them. The Catholic Church didn't have the money to take care of them. The synagogues didn't have the money to take care of them. And so everybody sort of just quietly let the abortions happen. They just didn't talk about them a lot. They called them relieving the flow. They had like these euphemisms that they used because they didn't ever use the word abortion. They called it unobstructing the woman. And so that was done mostly with herbals, with plants that caused, once they were mixed into tea or eaten, they caused a lot of cramping, and the woman would expel the pregnancy. And that was very, very common. And as a matter of fact, if you go back in time to even the Egyptians, those kind of remedies, so to speak, were used back in ancient times. So this was nothing new. Comstock turned the cart on its side, and all of a sudden, people were struggling to take care of pregnancies and limit their family size. And when I say limit their family size, it wasn't unusual for a family to have between 5 and 7 children. And they were poor, they didn't have space for everybody, they couldn't care for them, and this was normal. 50% of abortions or terminations in New York in 1900 were by married women. And you can imagine what it must have been like for a married woman with 5 or 6 kids at home. She was worried about childbed fever, which happened from infection, and her husband, who may be a laborer working with his hands, having to take care of those kids without her. And so there was a fear of death. There was a fear of being able to afford everybody. And so it was a tough time, and reproductive health was a big problem. So my protagonist, Hannah Isaacson, in the Hands of Women, the book opens with her as a young woman, one of the first medical students at Johns Hopkins. And she wants to go into obstetrics. She grew up in the Lower East Side and witnessed all of this backdrop that I've been sharing. And she wants to improve the plight of women. She's not quite yet a suffragette, but she's getting there. And she's really alone in that world, because at that time, in 1900, there were probably 4 or 5 female medical students in each medical school class. So I'm going to share what I call these incredible surprises that I got when I was researching. And there was a number of them, and I'll try and share a couple with you. So the reason there were medical students at Johns Hopkins in Baltimore was because there were women trustees of the university who were the only female, the only offspring that some of these titans had who lived in Baltimore were females. So they didn't have sons, because if there were no sons, that was the only way a woman could inherit wealth. So these women inherited enormous amounts of money, and when Johns Hopkins Medical School needed to build a hospital, they approached these women because their fathers or grandfathers had helped build the medical school, and they needed the hospital now. And they were probably some of the coolest women livers around. They met regularly. They built a school for girls in Baltimore, and when they were approached, they said, "Okay, we will donate and kind of get all of our wealthy friends to throw money in the can, but only if you do several things." And the first one was they had to make room for women every single year. And the second one, which was probably even more important for American medicine than the first, was they required that every student who came into that medical school met the requirements. Because before then, getting into medical school was who you knew. And there was a lot of payola and a lot of young boys from wealthy families who were without direction or problems. They went to medical school, and they were butchers. They had no right to be there. And until they put that quality requirement in place, medicine was really a rodeo, and it was one of the reasons why European medicine was so much further along. It was so much more sophisticated. There were so many more requirements to get into medicine. It was considered a nobler profession than it was considered in the United States. Because keep in mind, if you were a doctor, that meant when there was a typhus epidemic in the hospital, you got exposed. And when there was tuberculosis, you ran the risk of catching it. And a lot of the parents did not want their sons so close to disease. So there was a whole paradigm shift that happened in the early 1900s. Also, anesthesia was getting more perfected. So chloroform was getting used instead of ether. It was being used with pregnant women. The specialty of obstetrics had just come about, and with that, women started coming to the hospital to have their babies because it was pretty painful to have a baby without anesthesia. And so the midwives got scared because that was their business. So they started doing more and more abortions and using instrumentation. Now, midwives at that time, there were some midwifery schools, maybe 2 or 3 in New York and New York area, but most midwives learned their profession as apprenticeships, through apprenticeship. And so they didn't have anatomy labs. They didn't know where the arteries and vessels came together into the tissue. And there they were using sharp objects. And so, as you can imagine, a lot of horrible things started happening. And that also opens the story. So I think I've said enough without getting into spoilers. I like to think that the beginning of the book is pretty exciting. And people have said it's a little bit of a page turner because you want to find out what happens to these wonderful, heroic characters. But that's the setting that they lived in. I mean, it was just, imagine having a home like that and sleeping in a bed like that. And my father shared his bed when he was a kid with my uncle. And the big joke was that they'd start out on one side, but the mattress was so flimsy that when they woke up in the morning, they were in the middle on top of each other every morning. That was not unusual in the 1920s, 1930s, and that's 10 years after my story ends. So poverty in the United States was a really big issue for a long time.
All right. So let me drop this. Thanks very much. That was amazing. Eric Dreff, thank you for letting me share the dais with you. If we can call, hello? I'll get even closer. All right. Excellent. Right, so there's a lot to say. There's a lot of people here. I'm only going to abuse my position of power here, up here, just ask a couple of questions, and then we'll open it up to the floor.
Perceived power.
Right? Right, we'll open it up to the floor afterwards. I will repeat all of your questions into the mic so they get recorded. But first I just need to say a few things. Thank you to our sponsors, Sinai and Synapses. It's an institution that gave us grant money for this. They're funded by the Templeton Foundation and the Litauer Foundation as well. The purpose of the grant and the institution is to bridge religion and science, to talk about the divide, or the supposed divide that exists between them, and to kind of talk about how we are to understand them in the modern world. Temple B'nai Or, under the guidance of the staff and Rabbi Zatz, applied for the grant specifically to approach the question of what is a human. We are going to be talking about AI, advanced things in science and neuroscience and medieval philosophy and the rabbis, and we're going to be dealing with how Judaism has approached this question throughout its history. This is our inaugural event, so we had Jane's book launch kind of come and set us up here just to kind of talk about these types of questions. You can see how what she said already about the struggle for healthcare, for rights, for equality, for recognition, for medicine, and for the development of these things kind of tie into it. So I just need to say that, and now so my main question is, forgive me, this might be a two-parter, but in our discussions leading up to this, I found myself being a lot more negative in terms of the outlook. The more things change, the more things stay the same. You managed to keep a bit more of a positive outlook. Through reading this and through undergoing these things, I just wanted to know how you kind of understand the situation we might be in now, if you can give us a positive spin on things to kind of see through this, especially considering your intimate knowledge of how far we've come from there in the last 100 or so years.
Well, one of the things that I like about writing historical fiction is that even though the setting and the times and the technology and the clothing and everything outside of the skin changes, what's happening from the skin inside into our brains and our hearts and our personality is the same. So you think about like shows like Outlander. How many of you guys watch Outlander? Did any of you guys watch it? Oh my gosh, it's such a great time travel show. Yeah, the people move, we move through time and still feel love, and we still feel hate, and we still feel jealousy, and we still feel competition, and we still feel sadness, and all of those emotions that make us so human are constants. So when I started thinking about writing this book and about my great-grandmother Matilda, I just got consumed thinking about what it felt like for her to have cancer in 1900. And given the limited resources, I mean, GYN cancers were considered venereal diseases back then because they affected the women's reproductive organs. They thought that that the woman had been engaged in some behaviors and kind of deserved it. And it was terrible for them because they were shunned and they were alone and they were in pain. And I thought about what it must have been like and how they got through it. And then all of a sudden, stories began to form in my mind. And that becomes the fuel that makes you write, and you construct the characters, and you present these unbelievable challenges that they had. And you think about, well, what would a really smart girl do who maybe didn't want to just grow up and get married and make brisket? Who, you know, today, in today's world, would go to medical school or to get a PhD in something or invent something. They didn't have those options then, particularly if you were immigrants. So what would they do if they just were going to burst out of their seams with the limited choices they had? So those kinds of behavioral, emotional, motivational kinds of urges that we all have were the things that I took back in time when I constructed the story. So I think that, you know, to be positive about it, I think that we have the tools now, and we will continue in the next hundreds of years to improve these tools if we don't kill ourselves off, to keep making the world a better place. I really believe that.
Awesome, thank you. My next follow-up is a selfish one. I'm going to ask this as a scholar and researcher myself. In preparing for this book and in the follow-up, right, I think you're writing a prequel, is it?
Yeah, it's going to be published in May of 24.
All right, congrats.
It's called Threadbare. It's about the older sister's story, her immigrant story.
Awesome, that sounds interesting. So my question is, what particular obstacles did you find yourself overcoming in your first engagement with research? And how do you see yourself approaching the research question after having gone through it already? Like, what new things do you seek to overcome, or what might come easier for you as you engage on your next book project?
Well, what's really interesting is, and I think most historical fiction writers encounter this. I was at the Morristown Book Fair a couple weekends ago and was in a couple sessions with people who write in my genre, and they were saying things, I could put words in their mouth, because it's sort of a universal thing, that as a historical fiction writer, you have to find something unusual to spin your story around. And usually it's an obscure fact. So that becomes the fuel for the storyline. But in terms of the research, I just loved the surprises that I found. I'll share a second one. In The Hands of Women, Hannah, the protagonist, is in love with someone, and he takes her to the Waldorf Hotel to court her and propose. The Waldorf Hotel was on a strip of property, 33rd Street, I think, that was a century earlier owned by their great-great-grandfather, John Astor. John Astor came to Manhattan not so long after Hudson, and he was a fur trader. And at that time, Wall Street was an actual wall to keep the Indians and riffraff out of lower Manhattan, which was just the tip of the southern part of Manhattan. And John Astor bought a huge swath of land, and he thought he was going to leave it for his family. And so two of his grandchildren's grandchildren had property on that street, and one of them decided he was going to move uptown on Fifth Avenue by Central Park in one of the big mansions. Everybody was moving there. That was kind of the new hot real estate in Manhattan. And so he demolished his home, and he turned it into a hotel. And he decided that wealthy Europeans are starting to come to New York to see what this America's all about, this fast-growing city, and he built the Waldorf Hotel. Well, his aunt, Caroline, who lived down the street, was furious because she had to deal with all of these immigrants swarming the building and construction and more dirt than the dirt that they already live with. And she told her son, Charles, you better do something about your cousin. And first they thought that they would move uptown and build stables so the manure smell would offend the hotel guests. And then they decided, oh, we're not going to do that because they're making money over there. So they tore down their place and built the Astoria Hotel. And what they did was they competed with each other, and the Astoria Hotel was a couple stories taller than the Waldorf, and it was like the original John Astor was probably rolled a few times in his grave that this is what ended up happening with his goodwill. But then what happened was they turned over their properties because they were too rich to work. The people at that altitude, they didn't work. They hired people to do the work. And they hired this hotel manager from Europe to come over, and he's a German guy, I forget his name, but he came over and he proposed to the two cousins, let's merge the hotels. And we're gonna build this alleyway in marble with glass, and that way people could walk back and forth between these hotels. And they called it Peacock Alley because it became the runway for all of the wealthy New Yorkers to display their couture and so forth. During the 1920s, the hotels were doing very poorly, and they were knocked down and moved to where the Waldorf Astoria now is. And in its place, instead of the two hotels and the Peacock Alley, is the Empire State Building. Now that's cool. When you do research and you find yourself reading a story like that, first thing you think is, how do I get it into the book? Right, yeah. You know, because
really
it's
well,
so interesting.
Yeah, that point in the book comes up nicely. Well
it took a little massaging to get it in there without dumping it, but it was such a great story.
Right on. So I want to open it up to the audience, if anybody has a question. Nancy, please. Just so your comment is left on the recording, Nancy wanted to plug the book, support it, mention how well visually depicted it was written, specifically the focus on color and kind of really depicting and making a lively scene out of it.
So I'll make another comment because this was really my debut book, and the prequel is coming out in May. It's about Hannah's older sister, and she was the rags to riches story. And that story is based on just a handful of facts I have about my great-grandmother, Matilda. But of that handful of facts, I know that my father's side of the family were German Jews, and they weren't wealthy ones. They were poor German Jews. And they came over through Hamburg and came to Castle Island, which was the predecessor to Ellis Island. So before Ellis Island was built, there was a place called Castle Island, and that's where immigrants came through. And before that, they just came into the wharfs, and there was no control at all. But they came through Castle Island, and they went up to Harlem. Harlem was farmland at that time. They were just sketching out and building Central Park. And north of Central Park was mostly livestock farming, because it was very rocky there and it was very difficult to grow crops. And it was very, very uneven. And so I made him a poultry farmer for kosher butchers. That's fiction. But Matilda was 1 year old when she came over with her parents. And she married at 16 a man who was 12 years older than her, a 16-year-old with a 28-year-old. That's kind of a strange mix. Can you imagine? Are any of you 16? 15? 15. Can you imagine getting married to a 28-year-old man? And the reason in the book
don't imagine it.
Is that she didn't want to, when Harlem was getting raised and flattened to build buildings, the farms got moved. And there was actually a very wealthy man, they called him the Baron, and he was real. And he helped fund the moves to Sullivan County and Ulster County and Sussex County, New Jersey, for all of these livestock farmers, so that they could reestablish their Jewish communities in these places. And that's why the Hudson Valley, that whole area, had its roots from displaced farmers in northern Manhattan and the Bronx and so forth. And Tilly came down with her husband Abraham to the Lower East Side, because in my book he sells buttons. And so that whole story of how they go from the poverty in the Lower East Side to being successful, and they choose to stay in that area of New York, but is really the story of Threadbare. And most of it is fiction, like 95% of it is fiction, but it just seemed so likely to me. And when I thought about Matilda and I thought about the women on that side of my family, but all of the women on that side of the family have had ovarian cancer, every single one of us. And when I think about how bright the women have been, and I think about Matilda, and I think, well, what if she was really a smart girl? And she didn't want to just make babies and brisket. What would she have done under this situation? How would she have self-actualized? How would she have found herself and balanced all these forces? That's when the plot started coming to me. So the research was mostly surrounding that. Like, I'd check expressions, I'd check clothing, there were no zippers till 1920. So everything was with buttons. Buttons was a big business back then. what people ate, what they had in their homes. I went to the Tenement Museum and I took a look. Have any of you guys been to the Tenement Museum in New York? It's unbelievable. Can you imagine sharing a place that size with 10 people? I mean, you'd kill each other. I mean, and then the windows weren't open because the heat came from the coal oven. And so the air was filthy and it was not refreshed. And that's why tuberculosis hit so hard in the tenements, is there wasn't any clean air. So people would cough and it would get circulated through every apartment in the building. It was terrible.
Barbara was next.
So one of the things I find interesting about the history of science, of medicine, is that it's very male-focused. So the question of what is a human, for medicine, for many years has been a man,
Mm-hmm.
right? And a woman has been considered not really quite a man, but they're going to treat them like a man, which has caused a lot of problems. So even in the 1970s and 80s, we were starting to advocate for medical trials to be done on women and medicine trials to be done on women. So I was really, one of the things that surprised me in the book and excited me was her insight that women weren't the same as men, that they were still people, but they weren't the same. And she wanted to do things differently for them. So I was wondering, is this something that you speculated on? Was there some evidence that there were women who, by virtue of becoming medical practitioners, understood that women were different than men and women were still human and needed different kinds and levels of treatment?
So hold on. I'm going to do my best to capture the question. So Barbara's question comes at it from, if we're going to answer what is a human, the usual people who answer that question have been men, usually white men. But in the book, you engage the question, and Hannah engaged the question, and other thinkers or characters in the book engage the question of what is a human specifically as females. Females not as other to men, but as equally human and deserving of their own attention on their own ground, on their own approach as who they are, not as simply not men. And so Barbara was asking, how much of this is you interjecting this? How much is this from your research? How much of this was actually the case at the time? What's going on?
I interjected quite a lot of that because I don't believe that everything that they came to understand was scientific yet. For example, my family, generation after generation after generation, had breast and ovarian cancer, but they didn't understand genetics yet. They hadn't discovered chromosomes yet. So there's a point in one book, and in the book, where the Dr. Burroughs says, we know that there's something in families, but we don't know what it is. And we know because your mother and your grandmother died from breast cancer that you must be at higher risk. So I used that same kind of logic to get inside Hannah's head. Now, she's an obstetrician. She only deals with women. She dealt with GYN stuff and obstetrics. And she was trained on women and men, and she saw that women were overdosed. She saw that their bodies couldn't take the level of medicine that men's could. And if you take that a step further, that happened with children too. So pediatrics didn't come around until the beginning of the 20th century, and they just took a fraction based on size. They didn't realize that children might not even have the same reaction to a drug that an adult would. Now, of course, we understand that better, but are we done understanding it? No. And you're absolutely right, even in clinical trials now. The good thing about clinical trials now is that because so many of the drug manufacturers want to be able to understand a large population. They get multiple diseases, multiple genders, multiple ages, multiple hospital and research sites, and then statistically they can parse it out. And so I think that really helps having a much more massive population to draw conclusions from. But it's still, in 100 years, what we think of as modern medicine today is going to be looked at as medieval. I mean, how much radiation do we get? I mean, I don't think that radiation will be used in 100 years. It's going to be something else. I mean, ultrasound displaced a lot of radiation, and MRI has displaced even more. So we're in a very evolving world of medicine.
Awesome. So we're pushing up on time. There's going to be a book sale and author signing over in the lobby. I don't know what the name of that, in that gallery, sorry. But I did see Matt over there with his hand over there. He had one last question. So.
I know that Flexner report around the turn of the century had a profound impact on medical education. What was the impact on women in medicine based on that report?
So,
I'm not sure what report you're referring to.
Basically, in the United States, most of medicine education prior to 1910 was carried out in proprietary medical schools, often small schools. The Flexner report pointed out how problematic that was.
Yeah, I don't know.
all right. So
Sorry.
just to get that question onto the books, Matt was asking about a Wexner report in 1910.
I'll check it out.
that
I
apparently-
mean, I research everything. It's called the Wexler report.
Flexner report.
Lexner, okay.
Major change in how medical education was carried out from before 1910 to after.
Okay, so my book ends at 1907.
There you go.
So
All right. So the report came out in
you
1910.
can't put that on the test.
Changed education, but the book ends in 1907.
There is something, and I don't know whether it will affect as you go forward with your writing, but to some extent, yes, it has changed medical education, but not as much as you think. My daughter, who is in her early 40s, but my daughter is a maxillofacial surgeon. Her experiences going through medical school, and she has a dental degree first, and then she went on to medical school. The sexism was absolutely extraordinary.
Oh, well,
It was an uphill climb all the way through.
yeah. I mean,
So, I mean,
yeah, I saw that.
it's changed, but it hasn't.
I saw that as a hospital executive. I mean, a lot of what I wrote in the book was things that either I experienced directly or I witnessed. So, yeah, listen, there are particularly the generation my age that's aging out of medicine. That's kind of the last real male-dominated generation of doctors. But even in hospital administration, it's still very male-dominated. And the chief nursing officer who really is in charge of the care of every single one of those patients in the hospital, that's a pretty powerfully important position. They're treated like nursey nurse. So there's a lot more work to do. Yeah, I agree with you. So I'm going to just ask those who choose to read the book, if you like it, go on Amazon and Goodreads and put a rating up. You don't have to write anything, but those ratings do drive sales. And I was going to talk to you more about the publishing industry, but it's really hard for authors today. And so whatever people who like the book can do, whether it's on your Facebook and you take a picture of the cover, or Renee's reading group, or whatever you check out, if you can spread the good word, that goes a long way. And I've actually been filling up my dance card with a lot of book clubs from audiences like this, where people really want to talk about these issues because they're so current also, particularly reproductive rights right now. So that's my little,
So join me, everyone, in thanking Jane so much.
thank you.
And join us in the gallery.
Yeah, David will be doing sales, I'm going to sign.
And David has the list of the 5 people who pre-purchased the book. If you didn't pre-purchase the book, there will be books here available to purchase. So,
Oh, awesome.